The good news is that there is plenty of guidance out there for transit operators. The NIST cybersecurity framework is available. There is cybersecurity guidance from TSA. For the large operators, the TSA provides guidance in terms of in terms of money and in terms of support on the ground, both with individuals, with training, and there's other federal support both from TSS, cybersecurity framework, as well as the Cybersecurity Advisors Program. US DOT has some guidance, albeit slightly older. It does have guidance as it relates. It has more current guidance as it relates to autonomous vehicles and to ITS technology. I think there's and then the trade associations, particularly APTA, has done a very good job of making guidance available for transit organizations. So there is a fair amount of guidance out there for transit organizations. The bad news, please advance. The bad news is that resources are a limiting factor. As we all know, transit organizations are underfunded. They have competing priorities for limited resources. The pandemic has only made the situation worse. And as a result, cybersecurity is yet another unfunded mandate and is yet another situation in which you have another very important priority competing for a limited resource. And so it's not surprising that transit is not nearly as far along as we would have thought it would be, or that it should be, given how important it is. It's also not surprising that that the situation is being compounded as transit organizations become increasingly sophisticated. The more that we move into a mobility society, the more that we move into mobility on demand, mobility as a service, shared mobility, the more exposed transit operators become. And the more important it will be to implement cybersecurity protections. Please advance. Next slide. So the bottom line, unfortunately, was that we found that the industry as a whole was ill-prepared for the threats that they face. Well, this is a gross generalization. I think it is not a surprise to anybody that follows the industry closely. We've spoken to TSA, we've spoken to the Federal Transit Administration, we've spoken with APTA. They've all reviewed our report. They've all reviewed the conclusions and findings of our report, and unfortunately, nobody was surprised. I found that quite discouraging. I had hoped that our report would be met with fits of outrage. Unfortunately, it wasn't. There are certainly a number of really very good examples of transit agencies that have invested the resources and invested the funds that are necessary to take precautions and are doing so. But the vast majority simply don't have the time, the resources, or the sophistication to do what is necessary. And they won't until they suffer from a severe attack, like SEPTA suffered from last month. I mean, SEPTA suffered from a very significant attack last month and had to shut down its communications to its customers for a period of time. It had to shut down its internal communications for more than 2 weeks, and that's a significant impact on an operation. And I feel quite confident that SEPTA is in the process of doing a cybersecurity audit right now and putting in place new cybersecurity controls. Our report actually starts out with a really fascinating incident that many in the transit industry are quite aware of, and that is the BART extension, in which BART found that over 1,000 of its switches on a certain extension were counterfeit, and that they had been taken out of operation by foreign countries, reconditioned and put back into service with chips in them. And BART was lucky enough to have hired some cybersecurity experts from outside of the industry onto their team. They had a practice of double checking their hardware before they put it into operation. Luckily, the switches were from a large, sophisticated company, and they were able to track back to where track the life cycle of the switches, and we were able to find out that they had been taken out of commission. And by virtue of that, they were able to identify exactly where they'd come from, and then determine that, in fact, the switches had chips in them and were sending signals out. That initiated an international criminal investigation that's ongoing, and that has implications for a large number of transit organizations across the nation. Those things are going on all the time. So let's dig in a little bit more into our findings. Next slide, please. So incidental awareness. This is really an interesting slide and an interesting finding. So 22% of our respondents said that they had not suffered a significant incident. And by significant incident, we set the threshold fairly low, and that we compare that with a Dell study that looked at cloud people operating in the cloud, which found that they had suffered 82% of their respondents had suffered from a disruptive event. Well, it's not truly an apples to apples comparison. The 82% seemed much more consistent with the other research that we had seen in our research. So that either tells us one of two things. It tells us that that our respondents either are incredibly lucky, are incredibly good and sophisticated, or are not reporting that what is going on, or are unaware. And at least two of the four of those options are not good options. Next slide, please. So, and then this gets even more. This is even worse when you realize that they don't really have many of the agencies that reported did not have an accurate sense of their cybersecurity preparedness, and this actually gets to the what we found was that that 80% felt that they had the resources that were necessary and were prepared, yet only roughly 50% had a cybersecurity program in place, and less than 50% did an annual audit. And so these findings are inconsistent. I don't know how you can be prepared if you don't have a cybersecurity plan in place. Next slide, please. And another thing that is that is indicative of the fact that the 22% is not, in fact, representative of reality is that most agencies don't have log maintenance schedules. And log maintenance schedules are critical to an agency or any organization's ability to respond to a cyber attack. The fact that you retain your logs gives you the ability to rebuild in the case of an attack, and gives you the ability to not have to pay ransom in a ransom attack. Only 51% of the agencies responded that they retain log data for a year or more, which is a basic tenet. That means that 49% are retaining it for less than a year. 12% of the agencies do not retain their logs at all. So in the case of an incident, they would not be able to rebuild or restructure or respond to a cyber attack. They would not be able to retrace where that attack occurred and where it resulted. That's really very frightening. Next slide, please. And it goes further than that. It goes further than maintenance logs, because we see that. Next slide, please. We see that that organizations don't maintain, many organizations don't have the basic security documents that are necessary. Next slide, please. So in addition to maintenance logs, any organization that is in the business of providing transportation or providing services to the public needs to have a certain number of basic organizational documents in place in the case of an emergency or a security breach. Not just a cybersecurity breach, but a security breach. And we're talking about an incident response plan. We're talking about a disaster recovery plan. We're talking about a continuity plan, business continuity plan, crisis communication plans. These are just basic blocking and tackling. And you can see the numbers on this slide. The statistics are really quite frightening. For the most part, we've got more than 50% of the transit operators out that responded to this, that responded to our survey do not have these documents in place. And just as a side note, if I take a step back and give you a little bit of color to our survey respondents, the survey respondents tended to be the mid to large size survey respondents. So we're not talking here about the small transit operators. We're talking about survey respondents that selected into this survey. So those that have a reason or those that chose to participate. So this is pretty important stuff here. Next slide. We also found that that most transit operators don't have either the necessary skills or training that's necessary to respond to cybersecurity threats. There's no consistency within the industry with respect to what are the appropriate certifications. So there is a variety of organizations out there that will provide cybersecurity certifications, but within the industry, there's no standard certification. The percentages of certification of those professionals within the industry with cybersecurity certifications are small. The percentages of individuals who are getting training are small. There's not, essentially every employee within the organization should be trained on an annual basis at minimally. And the training should be differentiated based on whether you're the CEO or whether you're the receptionist. but everybody is vulnerable, and it's naive to assume that that everybody is not vulnerable. And let me just try to frame that for you in terms of just the basic phishing attacks. I can talk to you about an organization that I ran that was a sophisticated, large trade association in which the chief financial officer of that organization was the subject of a phishing exploit, and sent wired money inappropriately. We were able to ultimately get it back, but it showed that this was a sophisticated organization through a sophisticated bank, and we had the necessary protections in place. The same thing happens through access to a receptionist. If somebody can get access to the network through a receptionist, again, all they need to do is to get into the network. So again, this training is important and it's critical. Next slide, please. Good news is that we're seeing that many agencies are engaging outside vendor support. And this is important because this is a way that, that transit agencies, again, that are strapped financially and face many challenges can get additional support to address cybersecurity challenges. They can leverage some of their risk. They can unload some of their risk by contracting out certain activities. They can ensure that the contractual language requires that the vendor have in place appropriate cybersecurity protection. And so that is particularly when it comes to PPI information. And that's where you are seeing a vast majority of transit organizations are doing the most to protect themselves. And that's a really that's great progress. What we did see, though, however, is that only 38% of the respondents had standard language that they were employing in all contracts. So while we're seeing improvement, we're not seeing a standard application. We're not seeing standard kind of due diligence. I think that every transit organization, regardless of size, sophistication, and resource level, needs to, on an annual basis, go through its contracts and make sure that it has the appropriate cybersecurity protection language that in all of its contracts. So next slide, please. So we made a series of policy recommendations for the executive branch, for Congress, for the industry, and for their trade associations. At the executive branch level, we suggested that that the two co-equal there are two co-equal agencies that chair the TSS, or the which are the leads on the transportation security system leads for transit cyber, or for surface transportation cybersecurity, and that is the Department of Transportation and the Department of Homeland Security, and that they should promulgate basics, minimum cybersecurity standards, and that they should determine how those basic minimum cybersecurity standards are managed and implemented. They should provide technical guidance to transit agencies on the collection, retention, and assessment of system logs, and that they should require that transit CEOs and other transit CEOs attest that their organization has met these minimum standards prior to receiving any funding, their grant funding. Similarly, the transit organization CEO should attest that they have either contracted out any PII related activities or certify that their organization is PII compliant prior to receiving any grant funding. Next slide, please. We recognize that this is a new requirement, what we in Washington call an unfunded mandate. And so our legislative requirements, or our legislative recommendation, not requirements, I wish, our legislative recommendations are that Congress, in fact, fund DHS, US DOT, provide additional funding that is necessary for those executive branch agencies to do the recommendations that we discussed in the last slide. Next slide, please. And then as it relates to the associations, and the main association in this space, there are a number of associations in the transit space, the main association being APTA. UITP is an international trade association, and then you have ASHTO also provides some guidance as well. But they need to divide. One idea is to develop a clearinghouse with best practices and policies. And this should be done largely with the smaller or medium-sized transit agencies in place. That's really where the major struggles exist. We should create a minimum guidelines for cybersecurity audits. APTA should develop model cybersecurity contract language that can be adopted. Should develop model examples of the plans that we discussed before. And we need to recognize that transit agencies are very different. If you've seen one transit agency, you've essentially seen one transit agency, and they vary dramatically by size. And so you can't just do one example of an incident response plan. You have to do multiple examples. But we can, but they can't do, an example, a model for a large agency, a model for a mid-sized agency, and a model for a small agency that can then be adapted. And then the agency should also do model training and certification activities. Next slide, please. And then operators. I live in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is broke. And so much of what I'm talking about is not going to happen if we have to rely on Congress to do anything. So the operators and their trade associations are going to have to do this on their own. So much of this the operators can do themselves, and so what operators do need to do is they need to do an assessment of their capabilities. They need to put in place a cybersecurity plan. They can do that relatively easily. They need to evaluate their contracts. That can be done relatively easily, and put protections in place in their contracts on an annualized basis. Transfer responsibility or liability when they can. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. So if we can move to the last slide. I ran through this fairly quickly, but please, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you would like to see this report in detail, you can get it at, you can see the URL there, or you can reach me at scottfbelcher@gmail.com.